Yes, I'm going to get started now. Thank you all so much for bearing with the rain and the PCH evacuation. My name is Lara Stewart. I work for the Sunday Times, and I'm delighted to host this inaugural lecture from Nathan Yeowell today. So without further ado, let's start. There'll be opportunity for questions and then a discussion after as well.
Thank you for that rather over-the-top reception. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today, and a massive thank you to Lara for chairing this event. It's the Future Governance Forum's inaugural Addison Lecture, Nation Building from the Rubble, Politics, Purpose and the Transformation of the British State. It's great to have her back in London after her successful tour of duty for the Sunday Times in Washington, DC. And I'm sure that you'll all join me in congratulating her on her recent promotion as the paper's deputy political editor, even though she's just told me that she's far more right-wing than what I am, which some of you in this room, I'm sure, will find very difficult to believe. All I would say, though, if there are any briefers in the room, you can form an orderly queue once we finish the Q&A, and she'll have a notebook out, taking as many secrets from a Monday morning in Westminster as she possibly can. I'd also like to thank my friend Oliver Ryan, the Labour MP for Burnley, and his staff for sponsoring this event. And as if on cue, to the House of Commons catering and events team for their patience. As we batted our requirements back and forth like a game of parliamentary ping pong. For those of you unfamiliar with the Future Governance Forum, we were founded in 2022 and launched the following year as a progressive, non-partisan think tank, concentrating on the how as much as the what of policy design, development and implementation. Over the last 3 years, I like to think that we've built a reputation built on a combination of smart politics, original thinking and a commitment to practical delivery, where others have played a vital role in flying kites or mapping out political strategies. Up until this point, we have focused on the mechanics of getting things done. In this context, our mission is to help build a state that works for everyone. Delivering tangible results that people can actually feel and appreciate should be one of the most basic promises a government can make to its citizens, or that a council or a mayor can make to their residents. To this end, we've taken a range of important concepts, questions and problems and sought to explain, to answer and to untangle them in practical and hopefully straightforward terms. Some of the more notable projects have included a big piece of work we undertook last year into the reform and the reorganisation of number 10 Downing Street, a piece that came out last week and we'll be returning to in the autumn, setting out how we think the government can establish Great British Railways to be a success. We've produced frameworks for greater economic devolution and for model strategic authorities. We've done some thinking on the principles and practices of mission-driven government, which really should still be one of the main games in town. And I think whatever happens in the months and years ahead, we're going to have to come back and grapple with the concepts inherent in that mission-driven approach. We've also done work on new models of public-private partnerships that have been taken up by the Treasury. We've advocated changes to the fiscal rules, ditto. Reform of the UK pension system, as many of you will know, it's become an issue very close to my heart. And also a phenomenal piece of work, I think, on the reform of UK asylum and migration systems, trying to disentangle some of the rhetoric from the wider immigration debate to really focus on how we as a modern civilised country deal with legitimate asylum seekers coming to this country. So today's event marks something of a departure from this normal line of work, providing a public forum to air and to discuss some more abstract political and policy-related matters that we've tended to shy away from thus far. In future years, I want to develop this series as an opportunity for politicians, for policymakers and for practitioners to test and to debate the thinking that underpins their various schemes, strategies and solutions and the wider intellectual context they're operating in. We've named this lecture series after Dr. Christopher Addison, And before anybody, any smart Alec in the audience says anything, no, it is not a character from the thick of it. Dr. Christopher Addison, later Viscount Addison of Stallingborough, was one of the more compelling, if now sadly obscure, progressive politicians operating across the first half of the 20th century. After a distinguished career as an anatomist and a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, he entered politics at the age of 40 as the Liberal MP for Hoxton in the general election of January 1910, and served variously in New Liberal, Coalition and Labour governments led by Asquith, by Lloyd George, by Ramsay MacDonald and Clement Attlee. As Minister of Munitions and then the first Minister of Reconstruction, he spent most of the First World War thinking about and executing on a truly unprecedented scale for the time, the mobilisation of the burgeoning British state for the twin purposes of total war and peacetime planning. Appointed as the first ever Minister of Health in January 1919, he became the leading advocate for social reform and innovation in Lloyd George's post-war government, extending the scope of national health insurance and driving forward the coalition's ambitious housing programme known to posterity as Homes Fit for Heroes. The austerity-driven abandonment of this latter commitment led to Addison's resignation in 1922 and his eventual shift away from Liberal to Labour politics. In 1945, he became Attlee's leader of the House of Lords, where he was responsible for securing their lordship's consent for Labour's even more ambitious programme of post-war reconstruction and domestic reform, the like of which had ultimately eluded him and the country a quarter of a century before. I don't have time today to give Addison's work sufficient justice, although, as an aside, I am tempted to return to this topic in the future, in particular to the relative successes of reconstruction efforts after 1918 and 1945, and the comparative failure of modern governments to deliver on similar rhetoric employed during the COVID-19 pandemic. The most recent, perhaps the most appropriate, and certainly the most critical social crisis to hit the country since Addison's death in 1951. For the context of this lecture series, there are three reasons that make him a fitting honourand for FGF, all of which, I think, resonate with our mission, our work, and the times we're living through. The first is his particular progressive political perch, embodying, as he does, the churning, kaleidoscopic nature of liberal, Labourist and social democratic politics in the early 20th century. The second is his career-long dedication to testing the genius of the state in pursuit of ever more sophisticated economic, political and social goals, in particular in response to fast-moving demographic, financial and technological pressures. And the third is the suite of domestic policies that animated him, including housing, land reform, national defence, productivity and welfare, all of which sit as easily on a list of priorities in 2026 as they did in 1946 or indeed 1916. Moving to the substance of this lecture and where it fits within the broader sweep of our work at the Future Governance Forum, just over 2 months ago, we published our new 3-year strategy, Transforming the State to Renew the Nation, setting out our priorities, approaches and preferred programmes of work for the rest of this Parliament, thinking about how we repair, reinvigorate or create the institutions, services and markets that help shape and support the rhythms of national life. This morning, I want to take a step sideways, if you will let me, and then a stride upstream to talk you through the purpose behind our preoccupation with the transformation of the state, something that I think has rapidly become one of the most pressing causes in contemporary British politics, and that is the goal of renewing the nation. After a sustained period of political instability and continuing socio-economic stagnation, it's time for progressive politicians to come together with policymakers and practitioners to think about and create a new shared vision for this country, essentially to build and then sustain a positive and optimistic idea of the nation as a political and socio-economic unit fit to meet the rigours of the mid-21st century. To make this case, I'm going to break the lecture down into 3 parts. In the first part, I will sketch out shifting concepts and definitions of the nation before giving my reflections on what the current state of British politics tells us about the increasingly threadbare rendition of the nation that we're clinging to. In the second part, I will consider the highly contested nature of this debate, with particular reference to external influences on domestic debates. To counter this, I will set out a series of principles and provocations for a positive and optimistic vision of the nation that I think we need to grapple with and promote. In what has become a truncated third and final part, I will set out some themes that have emerged from FGF's work over the past 3 years, linking them together to form the beginning of some practical examples to aid the transformation of the state as we fix our eyes on 2029 and beyond. Before I start, I just want to set out what this lecture is and what it is not. It began life as the germ of an idea for a blog in response to an op-ed by Maurice Glassman, published in the Times last Christmas, extolling the historic virtues and what he saw as the contemporary travails of the Church of England and the inherent righteousness of a religious as opposed to a secular polity. My original aim to sally forth, taking gentle aim at his seeming hymn to theocracy, was quickly sidelined as my thoughts turned more generally towards the future of the state of the nation, and the need for a new form of more muscular progressivism to meet the geopolitical challenges facing us. As the composition process dragged on, and I pushed back the delivery of this lecture notionally from March to April, skipped May, but now to June, I have inevitably been overtaken by events. Although not conceived as a commentary on Sir Keir Starmer and his government, nor indeed as a commentary on the recent commentaries of Sir Tony Blair and others, I am struck by the need for all progressive actors, whether they count themselves as liberal, labourist, social democratic capitalists, to raise their sights and to raise their game for the challenges to come. And with that, part one, definitions and diagnosis. I'm going to start by defining what I mean when I speak of the nation, hopefully in clear language, as the danger of scampering down philosophical and terminological rabbit holes is quite high. The nation is distinct from the country, which refers to a specific geographic territory with defined borders and its own political system. This in turn is distinct from the state, which is the legally recognised and sovereign manifestation of that political system. The nation is the large community of people that lives within our clearly defined and specific territory or country, united by a shared culture or language, common values and shared citizenship, with a common past and a common project for the future. A general awareness and, crucially, an acceptance of these attributes and qualities help bind that community together, supporting the creation of a shared consciousness, a prerequisite, however intangible, of nationhood. More tangibly, the general integrity and well-being of the nation is the evolving expression of the political and economic choices made by politicians through the auspices of the state for the benefit of the country. It's important too to recognise that the nation is not an immutable concept. It is eminently changeable, if slow to turn. It is shaped by ideological and other intellectual and social forces, as translated by prevailing political economies and projects that have real and lasting consequences for the pattern of national life, long after the departure of here today, gone tomorrow politicians. In 2018, the historian David Edgerton published The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, acclaimed by The Guardian as a fierce and dazzling account of 20th century British history that prompted many of its readers, I think myself included, to reassess our collective sense of ourselves as a nation. His central thesis is that the imperial nation that reached its apotheosis during the Edwardian era, a very distinctive entity that was liberal and capitalist with a genuinely global outlook and an economic reach, began to change in the early 1930s and then move away from free trade towards economic protection. It was undermined with the advent of war in 1940 and utterly transformed by the new post-war global settlement and the election of a socialist government in 1945. To quote Edgerton, this new British nation emerged out of the British Empire and out of the cosmopolitan economy after the Second World War. Leaving behind empire entailed the rejection of imperial citizenship and imperialism and the development of a peculiar kind of nationalism. Leaving behind economic liberalism meant creating not just an economic border, but increasingly a culture of national self-supply. None of this was a product by choice of the British elites, who favoured free trading and/or imperialism projects, but they were thwarted by many brute realities. The national moment was the time of what might be called the developmental state, and not the 19th century, when the United Kingdom was at its most industrial. It was also the moment when it was refashioned by the state to look much more like its continental neighbours, with conscription and development of national agriculture and protected industry. This was the British nation of the emerging post-war consensus, where politicians like Attlee and Addison strove to ensure that the failures of post-1918 politics were not repeated after 1945. Commitment to the Western Alliance, the foundation of the modern welfare state, and the creation of new, broad, consensual national frameworks that gave structure to a new and broadly Keynesian political economy sustained this version of the nation until it began to buckle under a mixture of social and economic pressures in the 1970s. Margaret Thatcher's much-hailed revolution of the 1980s shifted the economic basis of the country, changing the foundations of the nation, replacing, in the words of historian John Wilson, a society of institutions and interests with a single homogenous people which shared her moral and economic convictions enforced by the state. Markets were increasingly liberalised, national industries and manufacturing competencies were broken up and privatised, and greater financialisation was promoted in the design and delivery of public services. The election of New Labour did not lead to any fundamental structural counter-reset. The governments of both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown operated within the prevailing economic, social and indeed historiographical systems that they inherited, as did other social, democratic and progressive governments around the world, although with a series of important measures and priorities that took the sharper edges off Thatcher's reforms and helped drag the country in the early 2000s into the new millennium, putting behind some of the social divisions that characterised those governments of the 80s and the 1990s. My contention is that this phase of the country's story and the concept of the nation came to an end with the great financial crash of 2008, but that repeated attempts to reassert the dominant political and economic systems that led up to that crash in 2008 have increasingly led to perverse, if not pathological, consequences for many people and the places they live in around the country. Slowing growth and productivity have meant that repeated governments' attempts to preserve or reform an economic settlement whose fundamentals no longer existed. The result has been a series of profound dislocations that have fundamentally shifted the political, social and ideological landscapes of the country. Austerity gutted many public services in more or less direct ways, and the consequent public dissatisfaction found increasingly disruptive and self-sabotaging expressions. Jeremy Corbyn becoming leader of the Labour Party in 2015. A Brexit vote in 2016, whose champions are still unable to accept as a Pyrrhic victory. The abandonment of pandemic promises after 2021, the abandonment of levelling up after 2022, and on the right, an increasingly intense push to replace political and cultural pluralism with an authoritarian, divisive, sometimes religious, and often racial nationalism. In this context, I think the challenge for progressives is to recognise that these disruptions reflect what are very often legitimate grievances that cannot be willed away. If they are not channeled into a narrative that is equally compelling and with tangible actions, these grievances will continue to snowball. That means going beyond diagnoses of the failures of today and articulating a vision of a better tomorrow. Part 2, Principles for a New Progressive Nation. In this context, I think my second main contention is that progressive politicians need to develop a more compelling vision of the nation that they want to create. For too long, they have forgotten or lost faith in their ability to set the political weather, rather than simply respond to it. Instead of just relying on polling and focus groups to scoop up voters in strategically significant seats, they must lead with a confident, long-term vision of the country's future political economy and make a values-driven case for it. I think there are 5 touchstones that can help build the foundations of a new progressive conception of the nation, and I will talk you through them now. The first of these touchstones, and I think perhaps the most critical, is the recasting of the progressive cause, once and for all, for this generation, as the primary patriotic political cause in the UK today. The populist right risks being seriously compromised, seemingly enmeshed in and sustained by a growing global network of nativist, Orbanist, and MAGA-inspired political, intellectual, and online movements that make a mockery of their claims to put Britain first. In April, last year's conviction of former Farage ally and UKIP and Brexit Party leader in Wales, Nathan Gill, on a pro-Russian bribery charge serves to highlight the ever-present threat of Russian interference on behalf of right-wing and other social authoritarian countries in this country. Reform UK's acceptance of cryptocurrency and other donations from non-dom millionaires raise serious questions about who is ultimately calling the shots in Farage's current political vehicle, and indeed to what end. On the other end of the political spectrum, the leadership and much of the membership of the Green Party has taken a Corbynite turn, making Gaza and Palestinian liberation central to their political identities, to the detriment of both domestic political concerns and long-held ecological policy positions. As we live in a much more volatile global context, I think it's inherent upon people in this room, definitely the politicians in this room, to think critically and in a sustained manner about how we come forward with a progressive vision of patriotism and actually standing up as the bearer of national politics and national security in the UK today. Indeed, my second touchstone is the primacy of national, of social, and increasingly of epistemic security. I think war in Ukraine and the actions of hostile nations such as Russia and Iran must be paramount in our minds, particularly as I was finishing writing this last night, the news was coming through about renewed Iranian attacks on Israel in retaliation for continued Israeli incursions into Lebanon. And I think I approve the current government is right to push for higher defence spending in this current context. I think what I would suggest is we need to think critically about how we integrate this into our economic revival as well. As the MP Liam Byrne wrote over the weekend, defence spending can strengthen domestic industry, it can support advanced manufacturing, it can create skilled jobs, it can deepen alliances, it can deter adversaries, it can help rebuild national confidence. I think we need to ensure that this generation takes the global national security threats as seriously as the generation did after 1945, and indeed all generations up until the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War in the late 80s and the early 1990s. In terms of social security, I think most of us will now agree that the current social contract, particularly around welfare, health, and pensions, is unsustainable. And we must work together to map out a new contract that speaks to the context of the mid-21st century and not to the context of the mid-20th century. I think many progressive politicians, policymakers and practitioners are animated by the social issues that they deal with on a daily basis. And there are times when I think many of us can get a bit too close to our subject matters and not always see the wood for the trees. But I think the moment we have reached now in the mid-2020s from a fiscal point of view and from the complexity of the social issues that are facing us, we need to seriously consider what is the role of the state in providing for the social needs of the nation, for the people that we live with in our communities across the country, and to show some boldness in sketching that out so we can come forward with a sustainable settlement that lasts until the end of this century, if not beyond. And the third of these securities, the concept of epistemic security, I'm glad to see Phil Tinline is here today in the front row. I know Phil, alongside colleagues from Demos, have been at the forefront of raising people's awareness of this, in that the fact that the continued rise of disinformation and online interference, both from domestic actors, but increasingly and worryingly from external forces, from sovereign nations attacking this country, is something we need to take very, very seriously indeed. I know the Prime Minister is stealing my thunder by giving a speech at British Tech Week, I think, at the same time that I'm speaking. And I know in particular looking at some of the issues around banning online content for the under 16s. But I'm glad that the government is beginning to take this seriously and to grapple with it. I think too many areas around online safety still resemble the Wild West, so we need to send some sheriffs into town to sort it out. The third touchstone is a commitment to a revived and sustainable political economy. The task here is huge, and whilst a better way is possible, there is no simple rhetorical cure. However, we have a huge amount to be optimistic about in this country, including our continuing strengths in further and higher education, world-class research, tech and innovation clusters, high-skilled professional services, and an unrivaled reputation for the rule of law. The challenge is to build a new political economy that turns these inputs into real and widespread beneficial outcomes for society. The way to do this is by shifting the UK from an extraction-based economy to a more productive one. The states must become more proactive in shaping and directing markets, rather than simply responding to their failures. It must be strong enough to deliver major projects effectively to increase the supply of things that people need. And it must actively direct capital from pensions and institutional investors towards productive investment, such as infrastructure, skills, housing, and energy systems. This capital should also be channeled into supporting successful startups so they can scale domestically and remain part of the UK's long-term economic success, rather than being acquired overseas for short-term financial gain. And finally, incentives, planning, and regulation should be designed to encourage productive work and investment, rather than the management of scarcity. It is only through this controlled capitalism that society can benefit from the power of the market. The fourth touchstone, I think, should be a commitment to rebuilding the bonds of our national community, neighbourhood by neighbourhood, balancing the collective needs of our local communities and, by association, wider British society with our personal goals and aspirations. I've always been taken with this quote from the New York Times journalist David Brooks. It could be that the neighbourhood, not the individual, is the essential unit of social change. If you're trying to improve lives, maybe you have to think about changing many elements of a single neighbourhood in a systematic way and at a steady pace. One of the signature facts of the internet age is that distance is not dead. Place matters as much as ever and much more than we ever knew before. The final touchstone must be an attempt to galvanise the public in this great mission of national renewal, if you will, to re-enchant the political process. I've always been struck by the following quote from US President Lyndon Baines Johnson, referring to his ambitious social programme, The Great Society, and his aspirations for America in the 1960s. The Great Society is not a safe harbour. It is not a resting place, a final objective, or a finished work. It is a challenge, constantly renewed, beckoning us towards a destiny where the meaning of our lives matches the marvellous products of our labour. I think we need to encourage some of this revivalist spirit in UK domestic politics. It's time to start believing in ourselves and the possibilities of a progressive political nation fit for the challenges of the 21st century. And finally, part 3. In the time I have left, I'm going to sketch out a further 6 principles that have emerged over the course of the Future Governance Forum's work that I think should and could underpin serious thinking and action about how we transform the state in pursuit of our goal of renewing the nation. The first is the concept of government as orchestrator and as storyteller. This is based on the need for the central state to act as a strategic coordinator, actively orchestrating national activity, whilst at the same time crafting and promoting a compelling public narrative that gives the country forward momentum, sustains wider legitimacy and encourages public participation. This stands opposed to the continuing model of central government as direct controller or active deliverer of strategies and services. Our research has shown time and time again that contemporary policy challenges are too complex for central government to solve alone. The centre of government needs to coordinate better across Whitehall departments, whilst simultaneously aiming to galvanise and mobilise across sectors and society in pursuit of national goals. The second is the suggestion that government should seek to purposefully and pragmatically disrupt policy and the workings of the state when necessary. Ministers and senior civil servants must break with incrementalism and entrenched ways of working, whilst avoiding the temptation to disrupt existing policy and ways of working as an end in itself. The scorched earth, disrupt and destroy approach piloted in the US by Elon Musk at the so-called the so-called Department for Government Efficiency should be avoided at all costs. Instead, we would suggest that government adopts the precepts of disrupt and deliver, rolling out models of reform that are bold, experimental, iterative and accepting of risk, characterised by testing policies in real-world conditions, continuous learning and a willingness to act under uncertainty. The third principle is the belief that successful institutional design must be downstream of institutional function, i.e., we must better align the machinery and mechanics of the state with the policy outcomes they are trying to achieve. We have found that when institutions are misaligned with purpose or have had too many extra responsibilities added on to their mandate, they actively undermine delivery, they slow down decision-making and contribute towards the erosion of trust. Many legacy arrangements at the centre, in departments, hidden away in arm's-length bodies, were set up for past and not for current challenges, let alone future ones. The fourth principle is the truism that crystal clarity is necessary for effective government. By this, I mean not just clarity of communication, although this obviously is vitally important, but also clarity about the ways in which responsibility, accountability, and intent are understood across government systems. On the other hand, ambiguity, of which there is far too much, encourages drift, inefficiency, weak accountability, and ultimately failure to deliver. Across too many manifestations of the state, at all levels and in all geographies, responsibilities are often unclear and overlapping, with multiple actors being involved in discussions without owning any outcomes. The fifth principle is the continuing imperative to reform cultures and behaviours at the centre of government. The work we did last year on transforming Downing Street really brought home to me that how different layers and arms of government behave internally behind their big black doors can be as important as structures and policy goals. Even well-designed institutions and pitch-perfect strategies will fail if the underlying culture discourages collaboration, experimentation, and respect for delivery. At present, the culture at the centre is often too closed. In practical terms, This means there is an over-reliance on familiar voices and weak engagement with external expertise, although it would be remiss of me if I didn't acknowledge the frustration of senior political and official leaders at this state of affairs. Across the span of FGF's work, we have found that culture also underpins other themes. Coordination fails without collaborative norms. Innovation fails without openness to risk and learning. Institutional reform fails if behaviours are too cemented. Clarity fails if accountability is culturally avoided. The sixth and final principle is that well-trodden theme of long-termism. Increasingly reactive decision-making, fed by short-term imperatives and enabled by out-of-sync institutions and behaviours, has harmed service delivery. Nor can the UK's most pressing challenges be solved within short political or fiscal cycles. This requires shifting how the state is organised, how resources are allocated, and how success is evaluated. Without this, political pressures and funding cycles will continue to reinforce piecemeal responses to hard problems, creating a system in which creative solutions and innovation are discouraged and non-governmental actors face uncertainty. So, summing up, the challenge I would set to everyone in this room, politicians, policymakers, practitioners alike, is to think seriously about the nation we want to live in and the values and institutions that are needed to sustain it. It is the great collective effort, I think, for this generation, and I look forward to seeing what we can create and sustain together. Thank you very much.